"He's so perfect," Julia said about his brother. John Laurie heard every word. His hand froze around the fountain pen. For a second, the velvet-draped negotiation room disappeared. No delegates, no translators, no treaties. Only that sentence ringing in his head. "He's so perfect about Martinez Laurie, his brother." John didn't blink. He kept his eyes on the rain-streaked windows behind the podium, pretending to review the treaty terms on his tablet. But his focus was on the reflection. Julia Edwin, his lead interpreter, standing near the translator's booth, her hand pressed to her chest like she'd just witnessed something sacred. And Martinez was at the podium in his tailored charcoal suit, smiling at the delegates, touching the earpiece in his ear like he was adjusting the volume. He glanced toward Julia, surprised, one eyebrow lifted. "I'm sorry?" Martinez asked, charm dripping from every syllable. Julia's eyes widened. I didn't mean to say that out loud." John set his pen down with care. His jaw tightened. His pulse kicked up speed. No one saw it, but he felt it. That burning mix of jealousy and something darker he hated admitting because Julia worked for the family. Because Martinez worked for him, because those words should never have been spoken in his presence. And still there they were. He's so perfect. How far would that go? How far would John let it go before he tore the illusion apart? Hello and welcome, my cherished friends and family. Take a deep breath, get comfortable, and be sure to subscribe. Tell me where you're listening from, and tomorrow, we'll have another calming story to share. For now, let's continue with our tale in peace. The first time Julia Edwin destroyed her own career, it was 2:14 on a Wednesday afternoon, and she did it with 2 sentences. She was standing near the glass translator's booth just outside the main floor of the Laurie Estates negotiation chamber. Her leather portfolio was tucked under her arm. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek low bun that kept slipping loose at her nape, and her nerves were already shot because John Laurie had summoned her at dawn with a message that said only, "High-stakes session, don't be late." She was trying not to stare at Martinez Laurie, failing. John's brother stood at the mahogany podium in a suit that looked like it cost more than her car, sleeves perfectly tailored, a gold watch catching the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. His hair was swept back, not a strand out of place, and he held the microphone in one hand while gesturing with the other, confident like he didn't have a single doubt in the world. Julia's closest work friend Adriana leaned closer and whispered, "You're staring again." "I'm not," Julia whispered back. "You absolutely are." "He's so perfect," Julia breathed, her voice coming out louder than she meant. "He finds the words I didn't know I needed." Adriana's eyes went wide. Her hand flew to her mouth. So did Julia's because the room went quiet. Too quiet. Martinez stopped mid-sentence. He turned his head. His eyes, blue, amused, sharp, met hers across the room. "I appreciate the compliment," Martinez said, grinning. "But I think you're supposed to translate, not critique." Adriana choked back a nervous laugh. The door at the back of the chamber opened. Every muscle in Julia's body locked. John Laurie stepped out. One hand in the pocket of his black suit jacket, the other still holding a pen that looked like it had just been snapped in half, ink staining his fingers. He was dressed in all black, no tie, white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, because John Laurie didn't do formal unless he was burying someone. His hair was dark and slightly too long, pushed back from a face that looked like it had been carved by someone angry. His tattoos crept up his neck, disappearing under his collar. His stubble framed his jaw, sharp and unforgiving. His eyes were the part that made diplomats nervous, deep brown, cold when he wanted them to be. Right now they weren't cold, they burned. He had heard. Julia felt it without needing confirmation. Her lungs forgot how to work for a second. John didn't look at her right away. He looked at Martinez. "Are we holding fan clubs during treaty negotiations now?" John asked, voice low, controlled, lethal. Martinez laughed. It was that easy, breezy laugh he used when things got uncomfortable, the one that made people think he was in on the joke. "Come on, John. She was just being nice. You know how Julia gets when she's passionate about the work." John's gaze didn't shift. He stood there, still as stone, ink dripping slowly from his clenched fist onto the Persian rug beneath his feet. Black drops on crimson wool. Julia thought about apologizing, about explaining that she hadn't meant for anyone to hear, that it was unprofessional and wouldn't happen again. But the words died in her throat because John wasn't looking at Martinez anymore. He was looking at her. For 3 months, Julia had worked for the Lori family as their elite diplomatic interpreter and linguist. She'd been hired to translate for Martinez during peace treaty negotiations between warring corporate factions, brutal talks where billions of dollars and thousands of jobs hung in the balance. Martinez was the voice of the family, the golden boy who spoke of unity and heritage, and building bridges where others saw walls. Julia had fallen in love with his words from day one. She'd never met anyone who could take the ugliest conflict and turn it into poetry. She'd never met anyone who made her feel like language was art, not just work. What she didn't know was that Martinez Lori had never written a single word of those speeches. Every phrase, every metaphor, every perfectly timed pause, it all came from John. From the silent, tattooed man in the back of the room who sat through every session checking his watch, looking bored, looking hostile. Julia had assumed John was the brute force of the operation, the enforcer who didn't understand the delicate art of diplomacy. She'd assumed he hated her work because he never once complimented her translations, never once acknowledged her presence unless it was to correct a scheduling conflict or ask for a revised transcript. She was wrong about all of it. John walked toward the podium. His boots made no sound on the carpet, but every delegate in the room turned to watch him move. Martinez's smile faltered. Just a fraction. Just enough for someone paying attention to notice. "John, we're in the middle of something here," Martinez said, trying to keep his tone light. "Give me 5 minutes and we can debrief after." John didn't stop walking. He reached the podium, reached out, and pulled the earpiece from Martinez's ear in one smooth, deliberate motion. The feedback screech was immediate, sharp, painful. It cut through the room like a scream. Delegates winced. Julia flinched. Martinez went pale. "The show is over," John said. His voice was quiet, steady, final. He looked past Martinez, looked directly at Julia, still frozen by the translator's booth with her hand pressed to her mouth. "You belong to the writer now, not the actor." Julia didn't understand. Not yet. Not fully. But something in her chest twisted because the way John said it, the way he looked at her when he said writer, it felt like a confession and a threat all at once. Martinez tried to laugh again, tried to play it off. "John, what are you doing? You're scaring people." John turned off the microphone with a flick of his thumb. The red recording light died. Session's over. Everyone out. The delegates didn't argue. They stood, gathered their tablets and briefcases, and filed out of the room in silence. Adriana grabbed Julia's arm, whispering, "We should go." But Julia couldn't move. She watched John hand the broken earpiece to Martinez like it was evidence of a crime. Martinez took it, his jaw tight, his charm cracking at the edges. "You're making a mistake," Martinez said, low enough that only John and Julia could hear. John's smile was cold, humorless. "The only mistake I made was letting you pretend to be brilliant for 5 years." When the room finally emptied, when it was just the 3 of them standing in the heavy silence beneath the chandeliers, John turned to Julia. "My office. Now." It wasn't a request. Julia opened her mouth to argue, to ask what was happening, to demand an explanation for why he'd just humiliated his own brother in front of a room full of international power brokers. But John was already walking away, the ink still staining his hand like evidence he had no intention of washing off. Martinez caught her arm as she moved to follow. His grip was gentle, his smile soft, but his eyes were sharp. "Don't let him bully you, Julia. He's jealous. He's always been jealous." Julia pulled her arm free and followed John out of the negotiation chamber, down the long hallway lined with oil paintings of dead Lori patriarchs, toward the office everyone called the Wolf's Den. She had no idea what was waiting for her behind that door. She had no idea that her life, her career, her heart, everything she thought she understood about the Lori family was about to shatter, all because she'd whispered 2 words, "He's so perfect," and the wrong brother had been listening. John's office smelled like old paper and rain. The kind of rain that doesn't stop, just keeps falling until you forget what dry pavement looks like. Julia stepped inside and the door closed behind her with a sound that felt too final, too much like a cell locking. The room was darker than the negotiation chamber, all rich wood paneling and leather furniture that had seen decades of family secrets. A single lamp glowed on the massive desk, casting shadows across stacks of documents that looked older than Julia's entire career. The windows behind John were floor to ceiling, rain streaking down the glass in rivulets that caught the light like tears. He stood with his back to her, still holding that broken pen, ink still staining his fingers. He hadn't washed it off. Julia wondered if that was intentional, if he wanted her to see the evidence of what she'd caused. "Am I fired?" Julia asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. John turned slowly. His face was unreadable, carved from stone and silence. "No." He walked to his desk, set the pen down like it was something precious he couldn't quite let go of. "You're reassigned." Julia's heart kicked. "Reassigned to what?" "To me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Julia didn't understand yet. John opened a drawer, pulled out a thick file, and placed it on the desk between them. "You'll be translating archival contracts, family documents, treaties from the 1800s, agreements written in languages most people have forgotten." Julia stared at the file like it was a prison sentence. "You're taking me off diplomatic work?" "I'm taking you off, Martinez." John said his brother's name like it tasted bitter. Julia felt anger rise hot in her chest. "You can't do that. I was hired to translate for the voice of the family. That's Martinez. That's the work I signed on for." John's jaw tightened. "The voice of the family is whoever I say it is. And right now, I'm saying you don't translate for him anymore." "Why?" Julia demanded, stepping closer to the desk. "Because I complimented him? Because I said he was perfect? I'm allowed to appreciate good work, John. I'm allowed to have an opinion." "You're allowed," John said quietly, dangerously, "to do the job I'm paying you to do. And that job just changed." Julia's hands curled into fists at her sides. She wanted to scream at him, wanted to tell him he was exactly what she'd always thought, a controlling brute who didn't understand the delicate art of what she did. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way he was looking at her, like he was holding himself back from saying something that would break them both. "I love that work," Julia said, and she hated that her voice cracked. "I love translating those negotiations. I love watching conflicts turn into solutions. I love being part of something that matters." "You still will be," John said. "Just not with him." "This isn't fair." John's laugh was short, sharp, humorless. "Fair. You want to talk about fair, Julia? Fine. Let's talk about how fair it is that you fell in love with a script." Julia froze. "What?" John picked up the file and held it out to her. His hand was steady, but his eyes burned. "Welcome to the Wolf's Den. Your new workspace is the desk by the window. You start tomorrow at 8. Don't be late." Julia didn't take the file. She stood there, trying to process what he'd just said, trying to understand why it felt like an accusation and a confession at the same time. "I don't understand what you're doing," she whispered. "I know," John said, and for a second, just a second, something flickered across his face, something that looked like regret. Then it was gone, replaced by that cold mask he wore so well. "You're dismissed." Julia grabbed the file from his hand, her fingers brushing his for half a heartbeat. The ink on his skin was still wet, still warm. She pulled back like she'd been burned. She turned and walked out of the office, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, her heart pounding in her chest like it was trying to escape. The hallway felt too long, too cold. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and texted Martinez. "What just happened?" "John reassigned me. I'm off your team." The reply came within seconds. "He's jealous, Julia. He's always been jealous of what we have. Don't let him eclipse what's beautiful between us. Even in darkness, stars still burn. I'll fight for you." Julia read the message twice. The words were poetic, comforting, exactly what she needed to hear. She looked back toward John's office, toward the door she'd just walked through, and thought, John is the darkness, and she had no idea how wrong she was. 3 days in John's office felt like 3 months. Julia sat at the desk by the window, rain still falling outside like the sky had forgotten how to stop, and translated contracts written in languages that made her brain ache. Old French, archaic Italian, Latin legal terms that hadn't been used since before her grandmother was born. The work was tedious, isolating, nothing like the electric energy of live diplomatic translation. But what unsettled her most wasn't the work. It was him. John sat at his desk across the room, and he never stopped working. He was efficient, brilliant, tireless in a way that made Julia feel lazy even when she'd been translating for 6 hours straight without a break. He typed with precision, his fingers moving across the keyboard like he was composing something sacred. He read documents with an intensity that made her wonder if he ever slept, if he ever let himself rest, if the weight of the Lori empire ever got too heavy to carry alone. She watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. The way his jaw tightened when he read something that displeased him. The way his hand would pause mid-signature when he was thinking through a problem. The tattoos on his forearms, dark ink disappearing under rolled shirt sleeves, told stories she'd never asked about. He never spoke to her unless it was to clarify a translation or ask for a revised document. The silence between them wasn't comfortable. It was charged, electric, like standing too close to a live wire and knowing one wrong move would burn you. Julia told herself she hated it. She told herself she missed Martinez's charm, his warmth, the way he made her feel seen. But late at night, when she was alone in her apartment, she found herself thinking about the ink on John's hand and the way he'd said, "You belong to the writer now." On Monday morning, Julia's phone buzzed, an email from Martinez. She opened it with relief, hungry for something that felt like connection, like poetry, like the work she used to love. The subject line read, "Homecoming." The body of the email was a masterpiece. Martinez had written about the Odyssey, about Odysseus and the Sirens, about how the song they sang wasn't really temptation. It was the promise of coming home to a self you'd lost along the way. He connected it to corporate warfare, to the way greed sings the same song, promising power but delivering emptiness. He ended with a line that made Julia's chest tighten. "The journey only matters if you remember who you were before the war." "I haven't forgotten. Have you?" Julia read it 3 times. She saved it. She wanted to print it and frame it, because this was why she loved her work. This was why she'd fallen for Martinez's mind in the first place. He saw the world in metaphors. He turned philosophy into poetry. At noon, Julia took a break. She needed air, needed distance from the silent tension of John's office. She walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, her heels clicking on marble floors that probably cost more than most people's houses. She turned the corner and nearly collided with Martinez. He caught her by the shoulders, laughing, his hands warm and steady. "Julia, careful. You trying to take me out?" He was dressed casually today, dark jeans and a fitted shirt, his hair perfectly styled like he'd just stepped out of a photo shoot. He smiled at her, that easy, charming smile that made people trust him instantly. Julia smiled back, relief flooding through her. "Sorry, I wasn't paying attention." "Story of your life," Martinez teased. He didn't let go of her shoulders right away. His thumbs brushed against her collarbone, just enough to feel deliberate. "How's exile treating you?" "It's not exile," Julia said, even though it felt like it. "It's just a reassignment." "Right." Martinez's smile dimmed a fraction. "John's being unreasonable. You know that, don't you?" Julia didn't want to talk about John. She wanted to talk about the email, about the beauty of what Martinez had written. "I got your email this morning," she said, stepping back so his hands would drop. "The one about the Odyssey. Martinez, it was incredible. The way you compared the siren song to corporate greed, the metaphor about homecoming. I've been thinking about it all morning. It was profound." Martinez blinked. His smile stayed in place, but something behind his eyes shifted. "Oh, yeah, that one." Julia waited for him to say more. He didn't. "The line about remembering who you were before the war," Julia continued, watching his face carefully now. "That hit me. Where did that come from? Have you been reading Joseph Campbell again?" Martinez laughed, but it sounded nervous, uncertain. "Babe, you know I don't really get into that heavy philosophical stuff. I probably just, I don't know, pulled it from something I read online." Julia's stomach dropped. "What do you mean you pulled it from something you read?" "I mean I don't sit around writing essays about Greek mythology." Martinez shrugged, still smiling like this was normal, like it made sense. "I just send you stuff I think you'll like. You're the intellectual one, Julia. I'm just the pretty face." He said it like a joke. Julia didn't laugh. "Martinez, the email came from your account. It was signed with your name. Are you telling me you didn't write it?" Martinez's expression flickered. Confusion, then something that looked like panic, quickly covered by that easy charm. "Wait, which email are we talking about? I send you stuff all the time." "This morning," Julia said slowly, coldly. "An email about Odysseus, about sirens, about corporate greed." "You're saying you didn't write that?" Martinez pulled out his phone, scrolled through something, frowned. "Julia, I haven't sent you an email in 3 days." The hallway tilted. Julia grabbed the wall to steady herself. "That's not possible," she whispered. "I just read it. It came from your account." Martinez looked genuinely confused now. "Maybe it was a delayed send? Or maybe John's messing with you? I don't know, babe. But I definitely didn't write anything about Greek mythology this morning. I was at the gym." Julia turned and walked away before he could say anything else. She didn't run, but she wanted to. She walked back toward John's office, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing through every email, every beautiful phrase, every late-night message she'd treasured. She pushed open the door to the wolf's den without knocking. John looked up from his computer, his fingers pausing mid-keystroke. "Did you need something?" His voice was calm, controlled, but his eyes tracked her like she was a problem he needed to solve. Julia crossed the room, pulled out her phone, opened the email, and held it up. "Did you write this?" John's face didn't change. He didn't look at the phone. He looked at her. "Yes." The room went silent except for the rain against the windows. Julia felt something crack open inside her chest, something she didn't have a name for yet. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been writing his emails?" John leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked under his weight. 5 years. Julia's knees went weak. She sat down in the chair across from his desk before she fell. 5 years, she repeated. Every speech, every email, every poetic line about heritage and unity and building bridges. "That was you." "Yes." "And Martinez just, what, took credit?" "He didn't take anything," John said quietly. "I gave it to him." Julia's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs to stop the tremor. "Why?" John didn't answer right away. He looked out the window at the rain, at the city beyond, at something she couldn't see, because someone had to be the face. And it couldn't be me. Julia stared at him, at this man she'd thought was a brute, a shadow, someone who hated everything she loved about her work. She thought about every conversation, every moment she'd believed she was connecting with Martinez's brilliant mind. She thought about falling in love with words that were never his. "I've been falling in love with a script," she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. John's jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists on the desk. "Yes, and you're the writer." John looked at her then, really looked at her. And for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something raw in his eyes, something that looked like pain. "Yes." Julia didn't go back to her desk. She sat in that chair across from John's desk and tried to process what she'd just learned, tried to understand how she'd been so blind. 5 years. 5 years of loving words that belonged to the wrong man. The rain kept falling outside, relentless, and John kept looking at her with those dark eyes that saw too much. "I need you to sign something," John said finally, breaking the silence. He opened a drawer and pulled out a document, thick and official, the kind that came with lawyers and consequences. He slid it across the desk toward her. Julia looked at it but didn't touch it. "What is it?" "A non-disclosure agreement," John said. "An update to your employment contract." Julia's stomach tightened. "I already signed an NDA when I was hired. This one's different." John's voice was flat, emotionless, but his jaw was tight. "Read it before you sign it." Julia picked up the document with shaking hands. The legalese was dense, suffocating, the kind of language designed to trap you in loopholes. She scanned the pages, trying to find the clause that mattered, and then she found it, buried in Section 7, subsection C. The signatory agrees that any romantic or marital union with a member of the Lori family will result in immediate forfeiture of all intellectual property rights, including but not limited to linguistic algorithms, translation software, proprietary methodologies, and any derivative works created during the period of employment. Julia read it 3 times. Her hands started to shake harder. "You're telling me I can't marry a Lori family member without losing everything I've built?" Her voice came out sharper than she meant, anger rising hot in her throat. "My translation algorithms? The software I've been developing for years? That's mine, John. That's my life's work." "I know," John said. "That's why I'm protecting it." Julia stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. "Protecting it? You're taking it hostage. You're telling me I have to choose between my career and my personal life." "I'm telling you that your career belongs to you," John said, standing to meet her across the desk. Not to any man you might marry, not to this family, not to Martinez. The way he said his brother's name made Julia's chest tighten. There was something underneath it, something bitter and raw. This is about Martinez, Julia said, understanding clicking into place. You're trying to keep us apart. I'm trying to keep you whole, John said, and his voice dropped lower, quieter, dangerous. Sign it or don't, but if you marry into this family without protection, you'll lose more than your algorithms. Before Julia could respond, her phone rang. Martinez. She answered it because she needed air, needed someone who would take her side without burying her in legal clauses. Julia, what the hell is happening? Martinez's voice was tight with barely contained fury. John just sent me a copy of some contract he's making you sign. He's trying to control you. He's trying to own your mind. Martinez, I don't think. He wants to keep us apart. Martinez cut her off. He's always been jealous of what we have. Don't let him do this. Don't let him trap you. Julia looked at John across the desk. He was watching her, his face unreadable, his hands flat on the surface between them. I'll call you back, she said, and hung up before Martinez could argue. She put the phone down and looked at the contract again. Do you want to own me? Julia asked, her voice breaking on the last word. John's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. No. Then why does this feel like a cage? Because you're not seeing it clearly, John said. He walked around the desk, closing the distance between them, and Julia's breath caught. He was too close now, close enough that she could smell rain and ink and something darker she couldn't name. That clause doesn't trap you. It frees you. It ensures that no one, not Martinez, not anyone in this family, can take what you've built and claim it as theirs. It ensures you own yourself. Julia's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, but the way he was looking at her made it impossible to think straight. I need air, she whispered. John stepped back, giving her space she wasn't sure she wanted. Take the rest of the day. Think about it. Sign it when you're ready. Julia grabbed her bag and walked out of the office, her heart pounding too fast, her mind spinning with everything she didn't understand yet. She drove to the one place that always made sense to her, the Children's Literacy Center on the east side of the city, the charity she'd built from nothing 3 years ago. She needed to see the kids, needed to remember why she did this work in the first place. She walked into the building, the familiar smell of old books and new crayons grounding her. The director, Susan, looked up from her desk and smiled. Julia, we weren't expecting you today. I needed to see how the new reading program's going, Julia said, trying to keep her voice steady. The one Martinez helped fund. Susan's smile faltered. Martinez didn't fund it, honey. The board voted against his proposal. We got funding from somewhere else. Julia's chest went cold. What do you mean the board voted against it? Susan pulled up the financial logs on her computer and turned the screen toward Julia. There it was. Board vote. 6 against, 2 abstaining. Proposal denied. But underneath that, a wire transfer. $200,000 from an account labeled Shadow Corp. Who is Shadow Corp? Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Susan shrugged. Anonymous donor. They've been funding us for 2 years. Books, supplies, teacher salaries. We wouldn't exist without them. Julia's hands went numb. She thought about Martinez at the gala 6 months ago, smiling for the cameras, giving a speech about the importance of literacy, taking credit for saving the program. She thought about John sitting alone in his office at 3 a.m, writing speeches for a brother who couldn't even remember what he'd supposedly said. She drove back to the estate in silence, the rain finally stopping, the sky clearing to something gray and heavy. She walked into John's office without knocking. He looked up, surprise crossing his face for half a second before he buried it. Shadow Corp, Julia said. That's you. John didn't deny it. He just looked at her, waiting. You've been funding my charity for 2 years. You paid for the books. You paid for the teachers. You saved that program. Julia's voice cracked. And Martinez took credit at the gala. Yes, John said simply. Julia looked down at the NDA still clutched in her hand. She saw it differently now. The clause wasn't a cage. It was a lock on a door, keeping predators out. Why do you pay for the books? She asked, tears burning behind her eyes. John didn't look up from his desk. His hand moved across a document, signing something with careful precision. Because you care about them. Julia stood there in the doorway, the contract in her hand, the truth settling over her like a weight she didn't know how to carry. She'd been in love with the wrong brother, and the right one had been protecting her all along. 2 days later, Martinez proposed. He did it at the annual Laurie Foundation Gala, the kind of event where cameras outnumbered guests, and every moment was designed for headlines. Julia wore a dress she'd bought specifically for the night, emerald green silk that made her feel elegant and exposed at the same time. She'd signed John's contract that morning, her signature feeling like both surrender and salvation. She hadn't told Martinez. She wasn't sure how to explain that she'd agreed to a clause that would legally separate her from the family she thought she wanted to marry into. She stood near the champagne fountain, trying to blend into the crowd of diplomats and power brokers, when Martinez found her. He looked perfect in his tuxedo, hair styled to perfection, smile bright enough to light the room. He took her hand and led her to the center of the ballroom before she could protest. The music stopped. The crowd turned. Julia's heart started hammering because she knew what was coming, could see it in the way photographers moved closer, the way Martinez's hand tightened around hers. "Julia Edwin," Martinez said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "You are the most brilliant woman I've ever met. You see the world in ways I never could. You make me want to be better, smarter, more worthy of standing beside you." He dropped to one knee. The crowd gasped. Cameras flashed like lightning. Julia couldn't breathe. Martinez pulled out a ring, diamond so large it caught the chandelier light and threw rainbows across the marble floor. "Marry me," he said. "Be my partner, be my voice, be mine." Julia looked down at him, at this man she'd thought she loved, and all she could see was the script. The beautiful words that weren't his. The emails written at 3 a.m. by someone else. The charity he took credit for while John paid the bills in silence. The pressure to say yes was crushing. The crowd waited. The cameras waited. Martinez waited with that perfect smile that suddenly looked hollow. Julia opened her mouth, not sure what would come out, when a voice cut through the silence. "Julia." She turned. John stood at the edge of the ballroom in a black suit that made him look like he'd walked out of shadows and into light. His face was calm, but his eyes were not. "Get in the car." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a threat. It was a lifeline. Martinez stood up, his smile cracking. "John, what are you doing? This is a private moment." "Nothing's private," with 20 cameras pointed at her face, John said, not looking at his brother. He looked only at Julia. "Get in the car. Now." Julia didn't think. She pulled her hand from Martinez's grip and walked toward John, her heels clicking too loud in the silent ballroom. Behind her, Martinez's voice rose, angry, desperate. "He's jealous. He's always been jealous of us. Don't let him control you, Julia." Julia didn't stop walking. John held the door open for her, and they left together, leaving Martinez alone in the spotlight with a ring no one wanted. The car was waiting outside, engine running, rain starting to fall again like the sky couldn't help itself. John opened the passenger door and Julia got in without a word. He slid into the driver's seat and pulled away from the estate, the gala lights fading behind them. Julia's hands were shaking. She pressed them against her thighs, trying to stop the tremor. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere you need to see," John said. His jaw was tight, his hands gripping the steering wheel like he was holding himself back from something. They drove in silence through the city, rain streaking the windows, streetlights blurring into gold smears. John pulled up to a small office building on the quiet side of town, the kind of place lawyers used for meetings they didn't want public. He parked and looked at Julia. "I need you to trust me for the next 10 minutes. Julia's throat was dry. "Why?" "Because I'm about to show you who Martinez really is." They walked into the building together, John's hand at the small of her back, guiding her through the lobby to a private conference room on the 2nd floor. Inside, a woman sat at a table with 2 lawyers. She was maybe 30, thin, tired-looking, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of years without sleep. She looked up when Julia and John entered, and something like relief crossed her face. "Thank you for coming," the woman said softly. Julia looked at John, confusion and fear twisting in her chest. "Who is this?" "This is Elena Moretti," John said. "Martinez's wife." The room tilted. Julia grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. "That's not possible," Martinez isn't married. Elena laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. He married me 8 years ago. I was 22. He was 24. We met in college. He told me he loved me. He told me we'd build a life together. Her voice cracked. He married me 3 weeks after my grandmother died and left me her estate, $2 million in a property in Tuscany. Julia sat down because her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. What happened? He took the money, Elena said. Transferred it to offshore accounts. Filed paperwork that made it look like I'd signed everything over willingly. Then he had me committed to a psychiatric facility. Told everyone I was having a breakdown, that I was delusional. I spent 2 years in that place before I found a lawyer who believed me. One of the lawyers spoke up. Martinez never filed for divorce. In the eyes of the law, they're still married. If he marries again, it's bigamy, and anyone who knowingly participates becomes an accessory. Julia felt sick. She thought about the proposal, about the cameras, about how close she'd come to saying yes. Why are you telling me this? Julia whispered. John leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her with those dark eyes. Because I've been paying for Elena's legal team for 3 years, trying to force the divorce. Martinez keeps blocking it because it would mean splitting assets. If you'd said yes tonight, your career would be over. Your reputation would be destroyed. Everything you've built would be tied to a crime. Julia looked at him, at this man she'd thought was her enemy, and saw the truth written in every line of his face. He wasn't stopping the wedding because he was jealous. He was stopping it because it was illegal. Because Martinez was a fraud in every way that mattered. The meeting ended with promises of paperwork and court dates. John drove Julia home through streets still slick with rain. The silence in the car was heavy, suffocating, full of things neither of them knew how to say. He pulled up to her apartment building and put the car in park. Julia sat there, unable to move, unable to process everything she'd just learned. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She asked. John's hands were still on the steering wheel, knuckles white. Because you wouldn't have believed me. You needed to see it yourself. Julia turned to look at him. His profile was sharp in the streetlight, all angles and shadows and barely controlled restraint. Thank you, she whispered. John finally looked at her. Don't let him ruin you, Julia. You're worth more than his lies. Julia got out of the car before she did something stupid like reach for him, like ask him to come inside, like beg him to tell her why he cared so much when he'd spent 5 years pretending he didn't. She watched him drive away into the rain, and she knew nothing would ever be the same. Julia checked the status of the UN position she had applied for weeks before learning about Elena. She had filled out the application at 2 a.m, sitting on her apartment floor with a bottle of wine she didn't drink and a future she was trying to rewrite. Lead linguist for the United Nations Diplomatic Corps. It was everything she'd ever wanted, the kind of role that would take her away from the Lori family, away from Martinez's lies, away from John's silent protection that felt too much like something she couldn't name yet. She had hit submit and told herself this was freedom. This was taking control of her own life. The rejection letter came 6 days after the gala. Julia opened it standing in John's office by the window, rain falling again because the sky had made rain a permanent condition. She read the first line, and her hands went numb. We regret to inform you that your application has been declined due to concerns regarding professional conduct and ethical violations. She read it again, and again. The words didn't change. Multiple sources have indicated a pattern of confidential data leaks and unprofessional behavior that make you unsuitable for a position requiring the highest levels of discretion and trust. Julia's vision blurred. Her breath came short and fast. This wasn't just a rejection. This was character assassination. This was her name, her reputation, everything she'd spent a decade building, destroyed in 3 paragraphs of corporate cruelty. She didn't remember walking to John's desk. She didn't remember slamming the letter down in front of him. But suddenly she was standing there, shaking with rage, and John was looking up at her with those dark eyes that saw too much. You did this, Julia said, her voice breaking. You blacklisted me. You couldn't handle me leaving, so you destroyed my name. John stood slowly, carefully, like he was approaching something dangerous. Julia, don't. She cut him off. Don't lie to me. Not now. I know how this works. 1 phone call from you and I'm unhireable anywhere that matters. You wanted to keep me here, keep me translating your archaic contracts, keep me under your control. So you made sure I had nowhere else to go. Her voice was rising, cracking, splintering into something raw. You couldn't handle me leaving, so you made it impossible. John's jaw tightened. He walked past her to his safe, the kind built into the wall behind a painting of dead patriarchs. He opened it with steady hands and pulled out a folder. He set it on the desk between them and opened it to a single printed email. "Read it," he said quietly. Julia didn't want to read it. She wanted to stay angry because anger was easier than the alternative, but something in his voice made her look down. The email was from Martinez's account, sent to 3 members of the UN hiring board. The subject line read, "Confidential reference. Julia Edwin." Julia's stomach dropped as she read. "Gentlemen, I'm writing off the record regarding Miss Edwin's application. While her linguistic skills are undeniable, I must in good conscience express serious concerns about her professional conduct. During her tenure with our organization, we have documented multiple instances of confidential client data being compromised. She has proven unstable under pressure and has demonstrated an alarming lack of discretion with sensitive information. I cannot in good faith recommend her for a position requiring the utmost trust and reliability. I hope this reaches you before any final decisions are made. Best regards, Martinez Lori, voice of the Lori family." Julia's legs gave out. She sat down hard in the chair, the email still clutched in shaking hands. "He sabotaged me," she whispered. "He destroyed my career. He tried to trap you," John said, his voice low and controlled but edged with something darker. "You're the one who makes him look intelligent. You translate his speeches, you correct his grammar, you make him sound like he has half a brain. He needs you to stay, so he made sure you couldn't leave." Julia looked up at him through tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Why would he do this? I never did anything to him." "You fell in love with the script," John said. "And when you started seeing through the performance, he panicked. Men like Martinez don't let go of things that make them look good. They just tighten the grip until you can't breathe." Julia's chest ached. She thought about every late night she'd stayed to help Martinez prepare for speeches. Every email she'd edited, every translation she'd perfected, every moment she'd believed she was building something beautiful with him. All of it was him using her. All of it was exploitation dressed up as love. "I'm ruined," Julia said, her voice hollow. "No one will hire me now. He didn't just destroy one opportunity. He destroyed all of them." "No," John said firmly. "He didn't." He pulled another document from the folder. "I hired a defamation attorney the day after I found that email. She's already contacted the UN board with a cease and desist, proof that Martinez's claims are false, and a formal demand for retraction. She's prepared to sue him personally and the family corporate structure if necessary. Your name will be cleared." Julia stared at him. "When did you find this email?" 5 days ago, the day after he proposed." Julia felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been holding back a flood she couldn't control anymore. "You've been protecting me this whole time. The contract, the charity, Elena, now this. Why?" John's hands curled into fists at his sides. He looked at her like she was asking him to confess something he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten where to find it. "Because you deserve better than his lies." Julia stood on shaking legs. She moved around the desk without thinking, driven by something she didn't have words for yet. She stopped in front of John, close enough to see the ink still stained on his fingers from that first day, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the restraint holding him back from something. "You wrote the words I fell in love with," she said softly. "You funded the charity I built my heart around. You protected me from a marriage that would have destroyed me. You cleared my name when I thought you were the one who ruined it." John's breathing changed. She could see his chest rise and fall, could feel the heat coming off him. "Julia, why?" she asked again, her voice breaking. "Why do you care so much?" John reached up slowly, like he was giving her time to pull away. His hand touched her shoulder, just his palm against the silk of her blouse, and the contact was electric. Julia felt it everywhere, a current running through her that made her forget how to breathe. "Because," John said, his voice rough and raw and honest for the first time since she'd met him, "I will fix this. I will fix all of it. And then you can decide who you want to be without his poison in your head." His hand stayed on her shoulder for 3 heartbeats, then he stepped back, breaking the contact like it burned him. Julia stood there, her skin still warm where he'd touched her, and knew she was falling. Not for a script this time. For the writer who'd been hiding in shadows, protecting her from ghosts. The media storm had been raging for a week following Martinez's failed proposal. Paparazzi camped outside Julia's apartment day and night. Tabloids ran headlines about the Lori family's mysterious interpreter who rejected the golden boy. Someone leaked Elena's story. And now, someone had leaked the UN rejection. Julia's phone rang constantly with reporters asking for comments she didn't have. John showed up at her door on a Thursday night with a duffel bag in one hand and car keys in the other. "Pack what you need for a week," he said. "You're not staying here." Julia didn't argue. She was too tired to argue. She threw clothes into a bag and followed him to the car, and they drove for an hour outside the city to a property she didn't know the family owned. The estate was smaller than the main house, tucked into woods that swallowed sound and kept secrets. Inside, it was all dark wood and stone fireplaces and windows that looked out onto nothing but trees and silence. John carried her bag upstairs and showed her to a guest room that felt more like a sanctuary than a prison. "Stay as long as you need," he said. "No one knows about this place except me." He left her alone to unpack, and Julia stood in the middle of the room trying to remember what normal felt like. That night, she couldn't sleep. She went downstairs around midnight looking for water and found John in the kitchen. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in jeans and a t-shirt, barefoot, making coffee like it was a religion. His tattoos were fully visible now, dark ink covering both arms from wrist to shoulder, disappearing under his shirt. Julia had never seen them completely before. They were beautiful in a dangerous way, all sharp lines and symbols she didn't understand. "Can't sleep?" John asked without turning around. "Too quiet," Julia admitted. "I'm used to city noise." John poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. They sat at the kitchen island in silence that wasn't uncomfortable anymore, just heavy with things neither of them knew how to say yet. "Can I ask you something?" Julia said finally. John looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Always. Do you want children someday?" The question surprised him. She could see it in the way his eyebrows lifted slightly, the way his grip tightened on the mug. "Why are you asking?" "Because I've been thinking about family," Julia said. "About legacy. About what it means to build something that lasts beyond you." She took a breath. "I can't have biological children. I found out when I was 23. But I've always wanted to adopt. Martinez told me he supported it. He said DNA doesn't matter, that love makes a family." John's expression darkened. He set his cup down carefully and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through something, then handed it to her. "Read that." Julia took the phone. It was an email from Martinez to his personal attorney dated 3 months ago. "Regarding the family trust and any future marriage, I need to understand the legal implications of adopted children. Specifically, can they be excluded from inheritance if I later have biological heirs? And if adoption proves, let's say, incompatible with my vision for legacy, what are the options for reversing such arrangements?" Julia's hands started shaking. She read it twice, 3 times, trying to make the words mean something other than what they clearly meant. Martinez viewed her future children as disposable, as PR opportunities that could be discarded if something better came along. "He was going to throw them away," Julia whispered. "If you had biological children with someone else later, he was planning to disinherit any kids you adopted together." John took the phone back. "I found that email 6 weeks ago. I changed the family trust immediately. Any child you adopt, now or in the future, inherits ahead of Martinez, ahead of me, ahead of everyone. Your family is protected." Julia felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Why do you keep protecting me from him? Why do you let him be the face of this family when you know he's corrupt?" John stood up and walked to the window. Rain had started again, soft and steady against the glass. "Because I made a promise to a dead man." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw. "Martinez is my older brother. He's legitimate. I'm not." Julia's breath caught. John turned to face her, and in the dim kitchen light, he looked younger somehow, more vulnerable. "Our father had an affair. I'm the product of that affair. Martinez is the heir, the golden boy born to the right woman at the right time. I was the mistake that got acknowledged but never fully accepted." He crossed his arms, the tattoos flexing with the movement. "When I was 20, I built the empire you see now. I turned a failing corporate mediation firm into a global powerhouse. I wrote the strategies, made the deals, created the reputation. But our father knew the world wouldn't accept an illegitimate son as the face of the family, so he made me promise, on his deathbed, that I would put Martinez front and center, that I would make him shine, that I would sacrifice my identity to protect the family name. Julia stood up, closing the distance between them. So you became the shadow. I became the writer, John corrected. I gave him my words, my strategies, my brilliance, and I let him take credit because I promised a dying man I would hold this family together no matter what it cost me. Julia's heart was breaking for him, for the years he'd spent hiding, for the empire he'd built that would never carry his name. You're not the shadow, she whispered. You're the foundation. Everything stands because of you. John looked at her like she'd just handed him something he'd forgotten he was allowed to want. The UN summit is tomorrow, he said quietly. Martinez is scheduled to give the keynote speech. He's terrified. He's been calling me for 3 days begging for the script. Julia's pulse quickened. Are you going to give it to him? John's smile was slow, dangerous, final. No, I'm done writing for ghosts. The air between them shifted, charged with something that felt like the edge of a cliff. Julia knew tomorrow would change everything. She knew Martinez would fall without John's words, and she knew she didn't care anymore, because the man standing in front of her had sacrificed everything for duty, and it was time someone fought for him instead. The morning of the UN summit, Martinez called John 17 times before breakfast. Julia heard the phone buzzing from her room upstairs, relentless and desperate. She came down to find John standing in the kitchen, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, staring at the screen like it was a countdown to something inevitable. Are you going to answer? Julia asked. John looked at her, and something in his expression made her chest tighten. Eventually, when he finally picked up on the 18th call, Julia heard Martinez's voice through the speaker, panicked and raw. John, please, I'm begging you. I can't do this without the script. The whole world is watching. Every network, every diplomat, everyone who matters will be there. I need you. John's face remained impassive. I'll meet you at the summit, 2 hours before your speech. Thank you. Martinez breathed, relief flooding his voice. Thank you. I knew you wouldn't let me fall. John hung up and looked at Julia. Come with me today. I want you to see how this ends. Julia nodded, her heart pounding with something that felt like anticipation and dread mixed together. They drove to the convention center in silence, the city waking up around them, oblivious to the fact that today would rewrite everything. The summit was massive, held in a glass and steel building that looked like it was trying to touch the sky. Security was everywhere. Cameras lined every hallway. World leaders and corporate titans filled the auditorium, thousands of seats facing a stage lit bright enough to expose every flaw. Martinez found them backstage, his face pale, his hands shaking. He was dressed immaculately in a navy suit that fit him like armor, but Julia could see the cracks underneath. He looked at John like a drowning man looks at a life raft. Do you have it? The earpiece? The speech? John reached into his jacket and pulled out a replacement device, identical to the one that had carried his voice into Martinez's ear for 5 years. He handed it over. Put it in. I'll feed you the lines like always. Martinez's relief was visible, physical. He hugged John, quick and awkward, then rushed to prep with the stage manager. Julia stood beside John in the wings, watching the auditorium fill, watching the cameras go live, watching Martinez pace and check the earpiece over and over like it was his lifeline. You're really going to do this? Julia whispered. John looked at her, and his eyes were dark and certain. I'm done being invisible. The lights dimmed. The moderator took the stage and introduced Martinez Lori, voice of the Lori family, visionary diplomat, architect of peace. The applause was thunderous. Martinez walked onto that stage with his perfect smile, his perfect posture, his perfect charm that had fooled the world for half a decade. He stood at the podium. The camera zoomed in. The crowd went silent, waiting for brilliance. Martinez touched the earpiece, adjusted it slightly, and opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He waited, smile faltering just a fraction. Still, nothing. Julia looked at John. He was standing perfectly still, hands in his pockets, watching his brother with an expression that could have been carved from ice. He wasn't speaking. The earpiece was dead. Martinez's panic started small, a slight clearing of his throat, a nervous laugh. Apologies, technical difficulties. He tapped the earpiece again. Silence. The crowd shifted, uncomfortable. Martinez started speaking without the script, trying to wing it, trying to sound like the man everyone thought he was. Today we gather to discuss, the importance of unity in global markets and, the need for cooperation between nations and corporations who sometimes, they have different goals, but ultimately we all want the same thing, which is peace and profit, right? The words were hollow, disjointed, empty. Someone in the audience coughed. A delegate whispered to another. Martinez kept talking, rambling now, his polish cracking with every sentence. He made a joke about offshore accounts that landed wrong, offensive, instead of charming. He mixed up treaty names. He called the European Union the European Unit. Sweat appeared on his forehead, visible in the harsh stage lights. The cameras caught everything in brutal high definition. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. Martinez was drowning on live television, broadcast to 50 countries, and everyone could see the emperor had no clothes. Julia felt a surge of something that might have been pity if it wasn't buried under years of his lies. Then John moved. He walked out of the wings and onto that stage with the kind of confidence that made people stop breathing. He didn't rush. He didn't apologize. He simply walked to the podium, and Martinez stepped back like he'd been dismissed. John took the microphone. The room went silent, not the polite silence of waiting for a speech, but the shocked silence of witnessing something impossible. John Lorry, the shadow, the enforcer, the silent brute, was about to speak, and when he did, his voice filled the auditorium like it had been built to carry it. Deep, resonant, intellectual, poetic. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the confusion. Allow me to clarify. Then he delivered the speech. The real speech. The one he'd written at 3 a.m. while the world slept. He spoke about the mythology of diplomacy, about the sirens that sing of easy solutions, about the hard work of building bridges where others only see walls. He quoted the Odyssey. He referenced economic theory and moral philosophy. He made every person in that room lean forward because they couldn't afford to miss a single word. Julia watched from the wings, tears streaming down her face, because this was the voice she'd fallen in love with. This was the mind she'd adored, and it had been John all along. When he finished, the silence lasted 3 heartbeats before the auditorium erupted in applause. Standing ovation, cameras flashing, delegates nodding with respect they'd never shown Martinez. John stood at that podium and let them see him, really see him, for the first time in his life. Then he looked directly at the main camera, the one broadcasting to the world, and Julia knew he was looking at her. I resign, John said simply. As of this moment, I am no longer the shadow of the Lorry family. I am no longer the voice behind the voice. I am done hiding. He set the microphone down, walked off the stage past Martinez, who stood frozen in humiliation, and disappeared into the wings. The auditorium exploded into chaos. Reporters rushed the stage. Delegates shouted questions. And Martinez stood alone in the spotlight, exposed, ruined, with nowhere left to hide. John didn't go back to the convention center. He left through the service exit while security tried to contain the media frenzy, while Martinez stood on that stage answering questions he didn't have scripts for, while the world realized they'd been watching a puppet show for 5 years. He drove back to the estate alone, the silence in the car so heavy it felt like drowning. He went straight to the one room in the house that had always been his, the soundproof studio in the West Wing, where he kept his vinyl records and his books and the parts of himself he'd never let anyone see. He closed the door behind him and stood in the center of the room, surrounded by leather-bound first editions and albums older than he was, and waited for the weight of what he'd done to crush him. He'd destroyed his brother. He'd broken his promise to a dead father. He'd exposed the family's biggest secret on a global stage. And for what? For a woman who'd fallen in love with words he'd written for someone else. For a woman who would probably walk away now that she knew the truth, now that she'd seen him standing in the spotlight instead of hiding in shadows. John sat down at his desk, the same desk where he'd written every speech, every email, every beautiful lie that had made Martinez shine. He pulled out a blank piece of paper and a fountain pen, and he started writing. Not a speech this time. A letter. To Julia. An explanation. An apology. A confession of everything he'd been too afraid to say out loud. He was 3 paragraphs in when the door opened. Julia stood in the doorway, still in the dress she'd worn to the summit, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes red like she'd been crying. She closed the door behind her and the room went silent, perfectly, absolutely silent. "You left," Julia said. Her voice was steady but her hands were shaking. "I looked for you backstage and you were gone." John set the pen down carefully. "I didn't think you'd want to see me." "Why would you think that?" John stood up, putting the desk between them like it was armor. "Because you let me love a ghost, Julia. You fell for words I wrote for my brother. You fell for a performance I created. Now that you know the truth, now that you've seen the man behind the curtain, I didn't think—" He stopped, his throat tight. "I didn't think you'd stay." Julia walked toward him slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between them one step at a time. "You're right. I fell in love with a ghost. But not Martinez." She stopped on the other side of the desk, close enough that John could see the tears still clinging to her lashes. "I fell in love with the words, with the mind that could turn conflict into poetry, with the soul that understood what it meant to build bridges in impossible places." Her voice broke. "And that was never Martinez. That was always you." John's hands curled into fists on the desk. "I let you love the best parts of me because I didn't think you could love the rest. I gave you my words through him because I thought my face would scare you away. Because I'm the illegitimate son, the shadow, the brute who doesn't belong in rooms full of diplomats and peace treaties. I thought if you saw me, really saw me, you'd realize I was never good enough." Julia's breath hitched. "Good enough for what?" "For you." The words came out raw, honest, stripped of every defense he'd built over 30 years of hiding. Julia moved around the desk. She stood in front of him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, close enough that the air between them felt electric. "John," she said his name like it was the only word that mattered. "You wrote the words that changed how I see the world. You funded the charity that gave hope to children no one else cared about. You protected me from a man who would have destroyed me. You sacrificed your identity, your legacy, your entire life, for duty." Her hand reached up, slow and deliberate, and touched his chest, where his heart was trying to break through his ribs. "You're not the shadow. You're the foundation. You're the truth I was looking for all along." John caught her wrist gently, his thumb against her pulse point. He could feel her heart racing, matching his own. "I have something for you." He reached into his desk drawer with his free hand and pulled out a document. Partnership papers. Legally binding, giving her 50% ownership of the firm, complete autonomy, power equal to his. "I don't want to own you, Julia. I don't want to control you or cage you or make you feel like you belong to anyone but yourself." He held the papers between them. "I want to be your equal. I want to be the only voice you hear, but only if you choose it." Julia looked at the papers, then at him, then back at the papers. She took them from his hand, and for a moment John's chest tightened with fear that she'd sign them and leave, that she'd take the power he was offering and walk away. Instead, she set them on the desk and pushed them aside. "I don't want the papers," Julia whispered. "Not yet. Not right now." She stepped closer, eliminating the last inch of space between them. Her hands came up to his chest, palms flat against the white shirt he'd worn to destroy his brother. "Right now, I want to know if the man who wrote those words can say them to my face." John's hands moved to her waist, settling there like they'd been waiting for permission. "Which words?" "Tell me you want me," Julia said, her voice breaking on the last word. "Not as your translator, not as your employee. Tell me you want me the way I want you." John's forehead dropped to hers, his breath mingling with hers in the soundproof silence. "I've wanted you since the first day you walked into that negotiation room and made my brother's borrowed words sound like they meant something. I've wanted you every time you looked at him like he was brilliant when I was the one writing the brilliance. I've wanted you so much, it's been killing me to watch him take credit for loving you when I'm the one who couldn't stop." Julia's hand slid up to his neck, her fingers threading into his hair. "Then stop hiding." The kiss was inevitable. It was 5 years of tension breaking. It was every word he'd written, and every touch he'd denied himself. John's mouth met hers, and the world disappeared. There was no empire, no family, no duty, just this woman in his arms who'd chosen the writer over the actor, who'd chosen truth over performance. Julia kissed him back like she'd been waiting for this, like every moment since she'd whispered, "He's so perfect," had been leading here. His hands tightened on her waist, pulling her closer. Her fingers tightened in his hair, holding him like she was afraid he'd disappear. The kiss deepened, turning from desperate to something slower, something that tasted like promise and future and everything they'd been too afraid to name. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, John rested his forehead against hers again. "Stay," he whispered. "Not as my employee, not as my translator. Stay as my partner, as my equal, as mine." Julia smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen on her face in weeks. "Only if you're mine too, always," John said, and kissed her again. 6 months later, Julia stood in a negotiation room that felt nothing like the one where this had started. The Lorry firm was under new management. John Lorry, no longer the shadow, stood at the head of the table as the legitimate CEO. Martinez was gone, checked into a rehabilitation facility on the other side of the country, learning to build an identity that wasn't borrowed. And Julia Edwin stood beside John, not behind him, as his partner in every way that mattered. She translated for him now, but it was different. He spoke his own words, owned his own brilliance, let the world see the mind she'd fallen in love with. Between sessions, he'd look at her and smile, that rare, perfect thing that he only gave to her. After the delegates left, John pulled Julia close, right there in the boardroom where it had all started. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For choosing the writer." Julia kissed him softly, her hand finding his where ink still sometimes stained his fingers. "He was never perfect," she whispered to herself, thinking about Martinez, about the script, about the beautiful lie she'd almost believed. But he is real, and real, Julia had learned, was worth more than perfect ever could be. If John's silent protection won your heart, hit that like button. And tell me in the comments, would you forgive a man who lied to save you? Or is the deception unforgivable? Subscribe for the next story, because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.